Hello, my friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we drift together into unanswered skies, slowly, calmly, and without fear. Here, we don't rush toward conclusions. We listen, we observe, and we let the mystery breathe. If these stories bring you a sense of calm or keep you company through the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Subscribing gently helps this space grow, and it allows more quiet minds to find their way here. You can also leave a soft like if the story helps you relax, unwind, or feel less alone beneath the night sky. And if any thoughts rise as you listen, you're welcome to share them in the comments below. And just out of quiet curiosity, where are you listening from tonight? I love seeing how far these whispers travel through the dark. Chapter 1. The First Glimmers. The night on Colares Island had always been a canvas of subtle sounds. In the warm hush after sunset, the river moved with a gentle pulse, brushing against the mangroves like a slow heartbeat. Insects hummed low in the shadows, carrying the scent of damp earth and salt from the distant sea. Lanterns glowed faintly in wooden homes, their light trembling across walls and floors. People spoke in soft tones, their words curling into the air like smoke, drifting and dissolving. Life had its rhythms, here predictable, calm, and familiar. Yet, on a night in early 1977, the air seemed to hold an extra weight. The breeze paused, just long enough to catch attention, and even the river's sigh felt deeper, as if waiting. It began with small lights. At first, there were tiny flickers, distant points above the trees, almost like errant stars that had wandered down from the heavens. Fishermen returning from evening trips noticed them first, their eyes catching a shimmer between the riverbanks. Mothers noticed them while drying clothes outside. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing, their eyes wide and mouths half open. The lights moved differently from anything anyone had seen, never drifting, never random. They hovered, shifted, and pulsed, as though aware of the watchers below. People tried to explain them. Perhaps a reflection on water. Perhaps distant aircraft. Perhaps the imagination after long days under the sun. And for a while, that was enough. But nights stretched on, and the lights grew bolder. They descended closer to the village, lingering just above treetops, winking and glimmering in a rhythm that made the skin tingle. One night, a young man stepped onto the riverbank, leaning on his fishing pole, trying to shake off the sudden chill that ran down his spine. The light hovered directly above him. He felt warmth on his face, not from the sun, not from the moon, but from something entirely unfamiliar. He froze, breath caught, as a faint vibration hummed through the air. The river seemed to hush. The mangroves stopped their usual whispering. Even the insects fell silent. Then, a beam, a thin, precise column of reddish lit reached toward him. It did not flicker. It did not hesitate. When it touched his chest, he collapsed to his knees, the world tilting as though gravity had shifted for him alone. Heart racing, he tried to stand. Weakness pulled at his limbs like an invisible tide. His vision shimmered, and he felt something leaving him: strength, warmth, a sense of himself that he could not name. It was neither fire nor wind, yet it burned and pushed in equal measure. That was the first time the villagers would whisper the word that would linger in their lives. Chupa. Chupa. They did not say it lightly. The name was born from sensation, not superstition. It meant suck-suck, the cruel mimicry of what the light seemed to do. They drained, they pulled, they touched without hands. Mothers held children tight as they told the story. Fishermen avoided the river at night, leaving nets and lines untended. Whole families huddled in the glow of firelight, eyes darting to the sky with every shadow, every pause of the wind. Doctors later described symptoms that words could barely capture. Siberia anemia burns, unlike anything caused by fire or sunlight. Puncture-like wounds etched into skin in triangular or paired patterns. Hair fell in clumps. Limbs ached with weakness that lingered for days. And still, the lights returned. Night after night their approach deliberate, measured, and unhurried. The behavior of the objects puzzled and terrified alike. They did not simply move. They observed. They hovered near doors. They paused over rooftops, sometimes retreating, only to return with meticulous timing. Witnesses spoke of hooks or filaments descending from the lights, brushing against skin, tugging at clothing, lifting slightly from the ground before withdrawing. Dogs whimpered and collapsed under their glow. Plants withered where the beams lingered. Radios and electrical devices faltered, buzzing with interference that seemed almost sentient. Fear was woven into the rhythm of daily life. Fishing at night stopped entirely. Churches remained open, filled with flickering candlelight and murmured prayers. Bonfires lined the riverbanks, not for celebration, but for protection. And yet, no plan, no barricade, no weapon could stop the phenomenon. The descriptions, collected later from hundreds of villagers, revealed remarkable consistency. Disc-shaped, cylindrical, spherical, sometimes like barrels, sometimes small as a boat, sometimes glimmering like dew on metal. Colors shifted: red, blue, green, yellow, violet beams that cut through darkness with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. And with each encounter, people understood one unshakable truth. These were not random lights, not natural disturbances. They were aware, intentional, and inescapably present. Even among seasoned adults, disbelief gave way to a primal recognition. One elder, leaning on a cane while watching from his porch, whispered to no one in particular, "It's as if the sky itself watches us now." And perhaps, in a way that no one could yet articulate, it did. For weeks, the village endured the strange rhythm of observation. Each night, hearts beat in synchrony with the slow descent of lights. Sleep became a rare visitor. Children awoke from nightmares, more vivid than any dream, speaking of beams that reached inside them, of shadows that were alive. Adults moved through the day with a careful, measured caution, avoiding open spaces at night, keeping lanterns burning far longer than usual. And then came the injuries. First, meal to warmth across a shoulder, a tingle in the fingers. Then more severe: collapses, bruises, burns, blood drawn inexplicably from healthy veins. Symptoms no doctor could explain. Families whispered about neighbors who could no longer work, whose skin bore the trace of contact with something unseen, whose hair fell in tufts. Medical examination confirmed the incomprehensible. Dr. Weleed Sisam Carvalho noted that hemoglobin levels were abnormally low in many patients. Burns appeared instantly, bypassing ordinary healing timelines. Punctures suggested contact with something far more deliberate than nature's hand. Animals, too, bore the effect. Dogs fell silent before collapsing. Poultry refused food. Cats disappeared. Even the mangrove vegetation near beam strikes appeared scorched. The community's life transformed under the light's careful watch. Where once laughter drifted in the evening air, now there was vigilance. Where once the river shimmered with reflected moonlight, now it held a subtle apprehension, as if every ripple might betray an approaching glow. Each night carried an unspoken question. When would the light descend next, and whom would it touch? By the middle of 1977, what had been curious fascination had settled into a measured dread. The Colares UFO phenomenon, once distant, once ignorable, had become intimate, deliberate, and hauntingly tangible. It was no longer a story to tell at the river's edge. It was a lived reality, a pulse in the village's heart, as inescapable as the tide and as relentless as time itself. And as the first chapter of this experience closed in whispered breaths and nervous glances toward the sky, a realization lingered in the minds of all. This was only the beginning. The lights watched. They tested. They left traces of themselves on the bodies and minds of the villagers, marking not just fear, but an intimate knowledge that something beyond understanding had taken notice of them. And for those who had glimpsed the beams, the river, and the sky that night, life could never return to the calm predictability that had once seemed eternal. The unknown had arrived, and it had begun its patient, deliberate observation of Colares. And so, as the villagers watched, the sky began to record its first secrets. Secrets that would draw the attention of those far beyond the river's edge. Chapter 2. Operation Saucer and the First Witnesses. By the time October 1977 arrived, Colares was no longer just a village under strange lights. The nights had grown heavier, the air tinged with a vigilance that could be felt in every step, every glance upward, every creaking floorboard. Families no longer drifted into sleep with ease. Children slept huddled together, lanterns flickering beside them, eyes flicking toward the ceiling at every subtle movement of air or shadow. Adults lingered by doors, peering out, waiting, listening. The rhythm of daily life had shifted into a continuous, careful anticipation. It was against this tense backdrop that the mayor, José Udoni Soeru, made an unusual and deliberate appeal to the federal government. He did not request more lanterns, more prayers, or even doctors. He requested the military, something official, organized, and capable of confronting what ordinary people could no longer manage. On October 20th, the Brazilian Air Force arrived. They came quietly at first, their trucks and boats moving through misty paths with a disciplined hush, carrying cameras, notebooks, binoculars, radios, and measuring devices. At the center of this mission was Captain Urung Bolivar Halanda Lima, a man chosen for his calm temperament, sharp attention, and ability to document meticulously. Alongside him were officers, sergeants, and specialized teams, their orders clear: observe, record, and protect. From the first night, the team realized that this was unlike any other assignment. The lights did not wait for introductions or formalities. They appeared, deliberate, near rooftops and riverbanks, hovering over mangroves, shifting color and intensity as if aware of the watchers below. Observers who had trained for precision, who had expected misidentifications and natural explanations, felt unease settle like a cold weight on their shoulders. Captain Ojanda, skeptical at first, documented the first encounter meticulously. Through binoculars, he watched a small, metallic disc hovering above a distant house. It pulsed faintly blue, then red, before releasing a thin beam of light toward the riverbank. The local fisherman on duty froze, then faltered under a sudden weakness that made him sink to the ground. The beam withdrew, leaving no scorch marks, no burning smoke, only an almost imperceptible warmth lingering in the air. Yet the fisherman's blood tests later revealed anemia so severe that doctors could scarcely explain it. The Air Force teams quickly learned that these objects were not passive observers. They responded. They adapted. Gunshots aimed at them elicited sudden retreats, only to see the lights return moments later, more deliberately than before. Spotlights, noise, and attempts to chase the phenomena did little to disrupt the rhythm of observation. The light seemed to possess an intelligence measured, curious, and capable of assessing the humans below with remarkable precision. Over the next several weeks, teams patrolled beaches, rivers, and villages, night after night. Each patrol was conducted with quiet care, for the lights had become skilled at exploiting any lapse in attention. Reports compiled by Captain Hollanday noted sudden accelerations, sharp angles, and silent maneuvers, impossible for any known aircraft of the era. Some objects seemed almost playful, darting between treetops or skimming the water, leaving reflections that danced like fire across the river's surface. Others were commanding, hovering over entire houses or entire families, sending thin beams that tested human resilience and courage alike. In the villages, people began to speak to the Air Force officers with cautious relief and subtle fear. Eyewitness accounts poured in. Stories of beams touching skin, of sudden collapses, of gusts of cold wind that seemed to accompany the lights. Parents described children woke in mid-slumber, frightened and whispering of orbs that glimmered just outside windows. Each account was recorded, sketched, and filed. The precision of the stories was striking. People, animals, and plants affected in ways the officers had not expected. Medical reports from Dr. Waylid Sisam Carvalho were delivered directly to the teams. She described puncture wounds, burns that developed instantly, and blood anomalies that defied normal explanation. Dogs and livestock had died after brief exposure. Vegetation appeared scorched or wilted near landing points. Radios and electrical devices intermittently failed, humming with interference as if the very environment had been altered. Every layer of evidence pointed to something beyond conventional understanding. The Air Force recorded hundreds of sightings in over 30 communities, creating detailed maps that traced the trajectory of the lights, their repeated appearances, and the patterns they followed. Waterways were a focus. Objects dipped beneath rivers, then re-emerged, glowing and undisturbed. The river itself seemed part of the phenomenon, not merely a passive landscape. Perhaps the most startling documentation came from sketches and photographs. Witnesses repeatedly depicted 8 types of objects. Discs with tiny windows, barrel-shaped cylinders, domes, trapezoids, triangular forms, pointed black and white objects, and glowing spheres, often accompanied by smaller orbs. The consistency of these descriptions, across unrelated testimonies, lent credibility to the reports. This was no collective imagination, no mass hysteria. This was careful, repeated observation of something, unclassified and unknown. Captain Hollanda's personal encounters would later capture the attention of ufologists worldwide. He reported seeing a humanoid figure roughly 1.5 meters tall, clad in a metallic suit, standing near a glowing craft. According to him, the being communicated calmly, almost assuredly, implying no direct hostility. Yet the encounter left an indelible impression. Hollanda also described an object implanted in his arm sensitive to touch, but invisible on X-Rathet would remain unexplained for decades. The military logs further recorded mysterious sounds, electronic interference, and the coordinated movement of multiple objects, some as large as aircraft, some small and precise, moving together as if orchestrated. Night after night, officers witnessed phenomena that blurred the line between technology, nature, and something entirely unfamiliar. When the first phase of Operation Saucer concluded, the military compiled over 500 photographs, up to 22 hours of film, hundreds of sketches, and dozens of formal reports. Yet publicly, the phenomenon was dismissed as unusual and unexplained, leaving no trace of the injuries, behaviors, or encounters that had left officers shaken. Files were sent to Brasilia, and silence settled over the case. Whispers of the investigation persisted among journalists, ufologists, and former military personnel. But the public remained largely unaware. The events of Colares continued quietly, echoing only in the memories of villagers, in sketches tucked in officers' logs, and in the medical reports of Dr. Carvalho. Decades later, partial declassifications would shed light on some of the operation's findings. Interviews with Captain Hollanda revealed first-hand accounts of intelligent phenomena, of objects interacting with humans in ways previously unimagined, and of evidence far more extensive than the public had been allowed to see. Researchers like Ajay Gavard and Marco Antonio Petty would uncover thousands of testimonies, while modern studies suggested microwave-like effects consistent with burns, anemia, and neurological symptoms observed by Dr. Carvalho. Colares, once a quiet village, had become a testing ground for the extraordinary. Operation Saucer revealed a phenomenon that was real, precise, and deliberately interactive. The evidence was undeniable, yet cloaked in official suppression, leaving curiosity and suspicion to flourish in the gaps. By the time the Air Force departed, the village understood something profound. The world beyond their riverbanks had noticed them. Someone, or something, had acknowledged their presence. The lights had touched them, recorded them, and moved on, but their mark remained, etched into skin, memory, and collective consciousness. And even as the skies appeared calm once more, the echo of observation lingered. Every flicker in the distance, every glimmer across the water, reminded the villagers and officers alike that what had been witnessed was not confined to memory. It was alive in the folds of the night, patient, deliberate, and quietly aware. The lights had been observed, measured, and documented, but their purpose remained a secret, waiting to unfold in the questions that followed. Chapter 3: Implications, Theories, and the Lasting Legacy. By the time the last patrols of Operation Saucer were packed away, Colares had already changed. The air carried a weight that no official report could erase, a memory that lingered in the rhythm of the river, in the sway of the mangroves, in the quiet footsteps of villagers who had learned that the night was never empty. The lights may have withdrawn, the beams may have ceased their direct contact, but their presence remained, imprinted in the minds and bodies of those who had been touched, seen, or merely watched. Even after the equipment was stowed and the officers returned to Brasilia, the questions multiplied. What had been observed? What had been left unrecorded? Why had the military quietly documented yet withheld so much. And, most importantly, what had the lights wanted? At its core, Colares forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable thought. Not all unidentified phenomena are passive. Some seem to interact, intentionally, with those they encounter. The beams that struck villagers were not random. They were precise, measured, purposeful. They caused burns, punctures, and blood anomalies. They touched children, fishermen, and elders alike. This was not mere observation. It was engagement. Theories began to emerge. Some whispered in the dim light of night. Others published with careful caution. The first, and perhaps most striking, was extraterrestrial visitation. Supporters of this idea pointed to the apparent extraction of blood or energy, the humanoid figures in metallic suits, and the systematic targeting of individuals. Was Colares a study, a survey, a test? Were these probes, biological samplers, or observers? And if the intent was not malevolent, why did harm occur? Why did humans suffer in such measurable, verifiable ways? Another possibility considered by researchers was experimental military technology. The Cold War had drawn attention to Brazil's remote regions, and speculation arose that advanced energy weapons, lasers, microwaves, or directed energy devices might have been tested under the guise of isolation. Such devices could account for burns, anemia, and neurological symptoms. Yet this theory too struggled to explain the behavior of the lights, submerging into rivers, moving without propulsion noise, responding intelligently to stimuli, retreating and returning with uncanny precision. Natural explanations were also suggested. Plasma phenomena, ball lightning, and rare atmospheric effects could produce glowing, moving lights. Humidity, magnetic fields, and equatorial conditions might amplify their appearance. But these phenomena are typically indiscriminate. They do not stalk individuals, do not respond to human interaction, and do not leave burns or puncture marks behind. Colares resisted simplicity. Some theorists, notably Jacques Baget, proposed frameworks that transcended conventional categories of alien or human. Could these events represent non-human intelligence, a form of conscious, adaptive phenomena, capable of interacting with humans in ways we cannot yet comprehend? Could they exist partially outside the physical forms we expect, operating through frequencies, energy fields, or subtle manipulations of perception? In this view, Colares was less an invasion and more a meeting a point where human awareness brushed against a broader, stranger intelligence. Psychological interpretations were offered, too, though they struggled to account for the tangible evidence. Mass hysteria, fear contagion, and cultural folklore could explain some reactions, but they could not explain burns, anemia, dead animals, or coordinated sightings witnessed by trained officers. Colares demanded a nuanced view, one that acknowledged human fear while respecting physical reality. And then there was the shadow that hovered over the investigation itself. Captain Halanda, who had led Operation Saucer, later spoke of encounters, an implant of intelligence beyond comprehension. His death in 1998, officially ruled a suicide, sparked speculation. He had begun speaking openly, sharing details that challenged the comfortable narratives of skepticism. Was his death coincidence or consequence? The records remain incomplete, the answers partial, the doubts persistent. Today, Colares persists in memory, in culture, and in the way we think about the unknown. The island has embraced its history subtly. UFO imagery and tourism, local stories passed down as caution and wonder, not myth. Internationally, the case is cited alongside Rendlesham Forest, Varginea, and modern Pentagon UP. Reports, it has become part of a growing recognition that the skies hold patterns, presences, and questions that evade easy explanation. The legacy of Colares is multifaceted. It is a warning, a reminder that phenomena outside human control can have real, measurable effects. It is a testament to human curiosity, to communities that dared to observe and endure without abandoning reason. It is a marker for governments and institutions about the weight of secrecy and about the consequences of documenting the unexplained while withholding the truth. Science, too, is reminded to remain humble. Colares teaches that some phenomena exist at the margins of current understanding, in the interplay between perception, environment, and the unknown. It calls for observation without assumption, curiosity without recklessness, and acknowledgement without fear. Perhaps most importantly, Colares teaches about patience. It whispers that the unknown does not need to be confronted with panic. It does not demand immediate answers. It is present in subtle interactions, in quiet alterations of daily life, in the sensations that linger after the light has passed. To witness is to respect. To document is to honor. To question is to stay alive in awareness. And so, the island remains. The rivers still reflect the sky. The mangroves sway under stars that may carry secrets we cannot yet decode. The stories remain, woven into memory, waiting for those who will listen without haste, without judgment, and without the need for immediate resolution. Colares does not give simple answers. It does not close the story neatly. It offers instead an invitation to observe, to question, to remain open-minded while maintaining reason, to honor the experiences of those who lived through something extraordinary, and to recognize that the unknown does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives with a presence that is quiet, deliberate, and luminous felt. In the body, in the mind, and in the silence of the night. And as the lights recede into memory, as the officers leave and the river returns to its natural rhythm, one truth persists. Colares remains a space where human experience meets the inexplicable. Its legacy is not only the lights and their beams, the injuries and records, or the whispers of witnesses. Its legacy is in the continued attention, the continued wonder, the continued curiosity that refuses to vanish even decades later. And in that quiet, patient space, the story of Colares becomes less about the lights themselves, and more about the way humanity responds, how we observe, record, and seek understanding in the face of the inexplicable. It is a lesson in humility, a lesson in awareness, and a lesson in remaining present beneath the night sky, wherever it may shine. The night holds questions that have no final answers, yet the echoes of Colares remind us to look up and wonder. Chapter 4. The night lights descend. The nights in Colares were never truly dark, not in the sense of street lights or neon signs, but in the subtle, living darkness that wraps around a river delta, where shadows fold into one another, and the air carries the rhythm of unseen currents. For years, villagers had known these nights intimately: the rustle of mangroves, the distant lap of river waves, the faint hum of insects moving through reeds. Life followed the cycles of the moon, the tides, and the soft whisper of wind against wooden rooftops. Then, in early 1977, something began to alter the rhythm. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A flicker on the horizon, barely above the treetops. A spark that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The fishermen, returning from long trips along the river, mentioned lights that hovered too steadily to be stars. Mothers saw dots shimmer through the windows of their homes before dawn. Children pointed, curious and unafraid, toward the sky, and the adults would pause, brows furrowed, sensing that these were not ordinary lights. By mid-year, the appearances became more frequent. Residents of Colares Island and surrounding settlements, Mosqueiro, Bahia do Sol, Vigia noticed that the lights seemed aware. They moved with intention, adjusting course as if avoiding branches, following paths that suggested observation rather than randomness. They were not silent fireworks, nor playful lanterns. These lights carried purpose. It was in this quiet escalation that fear began to weave itself into daily life. People did not speak loudly of it, not at first. Whispers passed between neighbors, words carefully chosen so as not to invite attention. Families would glance toward the sky during mealtimes, children tugging at skirts and sleeves, sensing the tension. Doors were left slightly ajar, candles lit, earlier than usual, animals brought closer to hearths and homes. The community adjusted in subtle, almost instinctive ways. Descriptions of the lights grew more vivid. Small crafts, some disc-shaped, others cylindrical or spherical, moved just above the canopy. Witnesses said that some seemed metallic, reflecting moonlight like polished stones, while others glowed with colors that felt alive: deep blues, sharp reds, greens that pulsed as if breathing, even violets that shimmered briefly before fading. The lights hovered, rotated, and darted with an intelligence that made ordinary explanations impossible. Then came the beams, thin, concentrated, precise. When the light struck a person, it carried warmth at first, a gentle caress across the skin. But that warmth deepened into pain, tingling, dizziness, as if something was being drawn outward. Some people collapsed, others stumbled. Many reported sensations of their energy, or something more tangible, like blood or strength being pulled from them. Families told of loved ones returning, from brief excursions to the river pale, trembling, eyes wide. With a fear they could not name, children were especially sensitive. They felt the presence of the lights before adults did, pointing toward the sky, their voices tight with awe and alarm. Parents would rush to their side, sometimes pulling them indoors, sometimes standing helplessly as the beams swept past, leaving no mark but an unease that lingered like a shadow over their hearts. Pets and animals were not spared. Dogs howled and fled. Cats hissed and crouched, and livestock near the shore sometimes collapsed without warning. Vegetation seemed to react too. Leaves scorched where beams landed, flowers wilting in patterns that followed no wind. Radios hissed and buzzed, sometimes failing entirely during sightings. The environment itself acknowledged the light's presence. Villages named the phenomenon chupa chupa, suck suck, a word heavy with fear and meaning. It captured the inexplicable sensation that something vital was being taken. The name was whispered, repeated, passed cautiously from neighbor to neighbor, a warning and an explanation wrapped together. And yet, amid the fear, there was also a fascination. Nights became a mixture of dread and observation. Some villagers would gather on riverbanks or atop low hills, watching the lights, trying to understand. Conversations were hushed, but persistent. What did they want? Why here? Why now? Attempts to confront them, shouting, firing guns, shining spotlights sometimes seemed to provoke a response. The lights would retreat only to return with renewed focus, moving faster, hovering lower, lingering longer. There were stories, precise and consistent, that spoke of beams, lifting people slightly, of hooks or filament-like appendages descending from crafts, catching a hand, a foot, or a sleeve. Victims resisted with desperate force-gripping tree bark, grabbing door frames, struggling against invisible pressure. The sensation was described as both terrifying and surreal, a combination of flight and restraint, of heat and numbness, of a pull that seemed to come from the sky itself. Dr. Luigi Cecin Carvalho, the local physician, began to see the aftermath with clinical detachment. She examined more than 40 patients with burns that did not match conventional patterns. Triangular punctures, sometimes clustered, sometimes paired, marked the skin. Blood work revealed anemia so severe it puzzled even experienced doctors. Other symptoms appeared: hair loss, persistent fatigue, blurred vision, insomnia, nausea. Some recovered gradually, others carried the effects indefinitely. The community adapted in subtle ways. Bonfires were lit along the shorelines, not for festivity, but for protection. Children slept closer to parents. Families remained indoors during the darkest hours, and fishermen abandoned night excursions. Churches stayed open late, offering refuge and a shared space for prayers and quiet observation. Even in the simplest actions, closing shutters, covering windows, watching the sky, the presence of the phenomenon reshaped everyday life. There were those who resisted fear. A few villagers sought to record the lights, sketching their movements, timing their appearances, and noting patterns. Their notebooks filled with observations, times, colors, behaviors, distances, and the odd interactions that seemed to respond to human actions. These records would later provide crucial corroboration for the Air Force investigation, showing that the light's activity was not confined to a single location, and that human witnesses, however frightened, were attentive and precise. Despite the terror, a rhythm emerged. The villagers learned to anticipate, to read the night sky in a new language of movement and pulse. They developed strategies to stay safe, traveling in groups, staying near fire, avoiding open spaces during peak sightings. And yet, the question lingered: what drove the lights? Was it curiosity, assessment, sustenance, or something beyond comprehension? The answers remained elusive, leaving room for awe, even amid fear. Children grew up under these lights, carrying memories that would later become stories, the kind shared in whispers around fires. Adults carried their experiences in altered routines, in quiet caution, in a heightened awareness of the night. The phenomenon became woven into the fabric of life, a presence that shaped behavior, perception, and community cohesion. This period of subtle escalation, the slow, deliberate descent of lights, the measured interactions, the careful watching of humans set the stage for what would come next. The arrival of Operation Saucer. The military intervention was not merely a response to curiosity. It was a necessary step in confronting a reality that had left a tangible mark on both people and environment. And yet, even as officers prepared to observe and document, the villagers' experiences held an undeniable truth. The lights were not random. They were aware, responsive, deliberate. The night itself had become a participant in the lives of those below, demanding attention, patience, and respect. The story of the descending lights is one of tension held in calm observation. It is a story where fear and fascination coexist, where the ordinary rhythms of life are interrupted not by violence, but by presence. And in that presence, a quiet dialogue unfolded between humans and the unknown, between observation and interaction, between wonder and the subtle weight of fear. The nights in Colares had changed forever. Shadows were deeper, silence more telling, and even in the absence of light, the memory of it lingered in every step, every glance upward, every restless sleep. People knew, as they had not before, that the sky could reach down, and when it did, it demanded acknowledgement. And as the villagers adapted, the world above began to take notice, and the stage was set for those who had come to observe from beyond their small island homes. Chapter 5: Encounters and Shadows. By the time the lights had fully descended upon Colares, the nights were no longer merely illuminated. They were transformed. They carried tension, anticipation, and an almost imperceptible rhythm that matched the villagers' heartbeat. Each household felt the presence differently. Some noticed it first, as a subtle warmth on their skin, a whisper of energy brushing across wooden walls. Others sensed it as a faint vibration in the earth, almost like a pulse in sync with the river's flow. And for some, it arrived as a sudden, inexplicable chill that ran through their bodies and left them motionless for a moment, eyes wide, listening to the silence that followed. It was during these nights that the first direct encounters began. Fishermen, who once moved confidently through the mangroves, now hesitated at the water's edge, feeling as if unseen eyes followed every motion. Men returning from late trips would tell stories of lights darting above their boats, hovering close enough to reflect in the ripples, casting colors across the river that seemed liquid in their brilliance. A green glow would slide along the water's surface. A red spark would flare and vanish before they could steady their hands. Children, curious and fearless in ways only the young can be, sometimes ran toward the lights, laughter mingling with gasps as the beams danced just out of reach. Adults held them back, shouting in low voices, tugging at sleeves, praying quietly, hearts pounding. Some beams touched clothing, yet passed through fabric as if it were not there, leaving a lingering warmth, or in some cases a sting that made the skin flush painfully. Parents noticed that even the smallest exposure seemed to drain energy, not visibly, but palpably, leaving their children pale and subdued for hours afterward. One evening, near the mouth of a quiet tributary, a young fisherman named Antonio ventured farther than usual. His boat drifted along the mirrored river, the oars slicing through calm water. He had not seen the light when it first approached, only felt the air thicken, as though the night itself had grown heavier. Then, slowly, a red beam slid from the sky, landing across the bow of his boat. It hummed with a sound he could almost hear inside his chest. The beam seemed to taste the air around him before settling on his arm. Antonio's stiffened muscles locking instinctively. The warmth turned to sharp pain. I felt like a thread of his strength was being pulled away. He gasped and stumbled, clutching the R for support. The light lingered, then suddenly darted away, leaving the river calm, reflective, ordinary once more. But Antonio was not the same. His body trembled for hours. His blood pressure dropped, and later at home, Dr. Carvalho noted that his hemoglobin levels were alarmingly low. She shook her head in quiet concern, her hands moving with professional precision. But her eyes betrayed a tension born from frustration. No known cause fit these symptoms. This was not an isolated incident. Villagers reported similar encounters across the island and neighboring communities. Beams seemed to target individuals, often choosing the solitary. Those walking between homes at night, or fishermen navigating empty rivers. Families described watching from doorways as lights hovered over loved ones, swaying in the air with a precision that was almost sentient. Animals reacted violently. Dogs barked continuously. Hair bristled on their backs, some collapsing in unexplained convulsions. Cats hissed and darted into hiding. Even chickens and livestock appeared uneasy, clustering together as if instinct sensed the danger before humans could. Vegetation near encounter sites, sometimes wilted or scorched in delicate patterns, almost artistic in their precision, a subtle evidence that the phenomenon left behind more than fear. The beams themselves were varied: red, blue, green, violet, yellow each. Hue carried a different effect. Some caused heat, others numbness. Some left immediate pain, while others induced a lingering fatigue that lasted days. There were reports of pins and needles sensations, dizziness, blurred vision. In rare cases, victims collapsed entirely, unconscious for short periods, awakening with memories that felt dreamlike, fragmented, almost hypnotic. In-household nights became exercises in quiet endurance. Families slept together in cramped rooms, listening for the hum of air, the glint of light through windows, the subtle shiver of wind along the walls. Doors were bolted, shutters closed, candles and lamps lit in careful patterns. Children clutched parents' hands, and parents held them close, whispering prayers and reassurance in low tones, careful not to provoke the unseen presence outside. Dr. Carvalho's role became pivotal. Her examination room, once a place of routine care, became a sanctuary and a center of analysis. She documented burns that did not follow the patterns of fire, punctures arranged in geometric forms, and hair loss that defied explanation. Blood tests revealed repeated patterns: Siberia anemia, low hemoglobin, sometimes sudden drops in white blood cells. She treated patients with quiet diligence, her notes meticulous, her questions carefully framed to avoid panic. Yet, even amidst this careful observation, the villagers' perception of the lights grew. They began to notice behavior. The lights responded. Gunfire, shouts, and attempts to scare them sometimes caused retreat, but not retreat in randomness. Instead, the lights returned in the same night, adjusting their approach, shifting angles, hovering closer to targets. Spotlights trained on them provoked sudden, precise maneuvers, as if testing, observing, measuring reactions. It was an interaction, deliberate and intelligent, but without communication in words. Stories circulated about attempts at defense. A fisherman fired a rifle toward a hovering craft, the shot passing harmlessly through its glow. The light recoiled, paused, then returned with an intensity that left the witness shaken, kneeling on the riverbank, hands gripping the wood of his boat. In one particularly harrowing tale, a woman reported seeing a thin, hook-like appendage descend from a craft. It caught the hem of her dress and lifted slightly, tugging her upward before she grasped a nearby tree. Heart hammering, muscles taut. The light retreated only when she steadied herself, but the sensation lingered, an awareness of presence, of interaction, of something that did not belong to the ordinary world. Even in these frightening moments, a strange sense of rhythm emerged. Villagers began to anticipate the lights, noting times and patterns. Nights were mapped in silent observation. Rivers traced in careful paths, windows and doorways examined 4 angles of approach. Families spoke in hushed tones, sharing what they had seen, interpreting behavior, exchanging strategies. Fear and awe intertwined, producing a community tuned to the subtle signals of the sky. Children carried these experiences into dreams, adults into routines, and the elderly into stories that wove caution, observation, and wonder. The lights became more than phenomena. They became teachers of attention, of presence, of the delicate boundary between safety and exposure. Every encounter left traces. On skin, in blood, in memory, in the subtle change of daily habits. The world had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. As the encounters continued, the need for explanation grew louder. While villagers kept careful records, sketches, and narratives, the scope of the phenomena outstripped local understanding. The lights were not merely lights, they were actors with intent. Behaviors that challenged rational interpretation, leaving evidence that even professionals like Dr. Carvalho could not explain entirely. And so, by the time authorities became aware, the groundwork was laid. The lights had not only descended, they had left shadows in the lives of the people, in the land, and in the patterns of daily existence. Shadows that would follow the story into the hands of military observers, into Operation Saucer, and into records that the world would only later see. In these nights of interaction, Colares learned to exist in two states simultaneously, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Life continued. Rivers flowed, markets opened, children played. Meals were prepared, but always beneath a sky that could reach down, that could brush a hand across the shoulder, that could alter sleep, blood, and awareness with a presence that was quiet yet profound. The lights were no longer distant curiosities. They were intimately, impossibly close. They had become a part of the night, a part of the rhythm of Colares itself. And as the people adapted, learned, and endured, the stage was set for the world beyond the island to finally take notice, and for human handstows of the military to step into this delicate, luminous web. And when the outside world finally intervened, the quiet rhythm of Colares would shift again, this time under watchful eyes in uniform. Chapter 6. Operation Saucer. Eyes in the night. By the time the Brazilian Air Force arrived on Colares Island, the nights had already acquired a strange, measured tension. The villagers had grown accustomed to glancing skyward, to feeling the pulse of something unseen brushing against the edges of their lives. Boats moved cautiously along reflective waters. Children clung to parents with a quiet, knowing dread. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, fires were lit, and prayers whispered not out of hope for miracles, but as small anchors of stability. Into this delicate balance stepped men in uniform, cameras slung over shoulders, radios clipped to belts, notebooks ready to capture details that had long been whispered in darkness. The mission, known internally as Operaco Protor, Operation Saucer, was meticulously organized. Captain Yorong, Bolivar Ollanta Lima, a man accustomed to discipline and logic, led the team with a steady hand. Beside him were officers, technical specialists, and enlisted men tasked with observation, documentation, and protection of both themselves and the civilians they now shared this strange, luminous stage with. Yet even seasoned professionals felt the peculiar weight of Colares nights, as if the very air had a pulse and the river carried its own kind of awareness. Their first nights were tentative. The officers moved along beaches, patrolled mangrove paths, and stationed themselves near homes where the light encounters had been most frequent. They carried cameras, both still and film binoculars, radios, and notebooks, prepared to record anything unusual. At first, they observed quiet skies. Stars glimmered, water mirrored silver moonlight, and the ordinary rhythms of the Amazon Delta unfolded like a slow, meditative film. Yet every shadow, every glimmer, carried potential. Every rustle of leaves or ripple in the river became a cue to lift a lens, to steady a hand, to wait. Then, inevitably, the lights appeared. They arrived subtly at first, slipping between treetops and drifting above rivers with a fluidity that defied expectation. Unlike the villagers' descriptions of beams that could strike without warning, these objects moved deliberately, sometimes hovering, sometimes darting with sudden precision. The officers witnessed them in close proximity, the craft's forms revealing an astonishing diversity. Discs with glowing windows, cylinders like barrels floating effortlessly above water, domes reflecting moonlight, and spheres that shimmered in colors unrecorded in the natural spectrum. Some orbs traveled in pairs or trios, coordinated as though aware of each other's position. The first physical encounters with the phenomenon left the observers unsettled. During one patrol along a narrow channel, a red beam descended across the water's surface, striking a nearby wooden dock. The men froze. The beam was solid-seeming, yet intangible. Warm, but not burning in a conventional sense. Its intensity made muscles tense involuntarily, and a subtle pressure pressed against the chest, as though the air itself were being drawn outward. One officer described the sensation as a tingling awareness that stretched beyond physical sensations, something that touched both body and mind simultaneously. Captain Hollander meticulously recorded every detail. He noted the direction of movement, the color, the intensity of the light, and its effects on humans, animals, and even vegetation. Dogs cowered, chickens ran frantically, and small trees bent slightly under no discernible force. In some instances, the lights entered the water, disappearing beneath the surface, only to reappear moments later, glowing with a phosphorescent blue that made the river seem alive with energy. The observers quickly realized that conventional understanding could not account for these behaviors. Boats had engines. Animals had instincts. Humans had reflexes, but the lights operated beyond these limits, responding with apparent intelligence. The night stretched endlessly, each hour revealing more nuance. In one incident, the lights reacted to gunfire, not with retreat and panic, but with a calculated adjustment of trajectory. Spotlights caused sudden pauses, rotations, shifts in hue, yet no attack followed. The lights were testing, measuring, learning perhaps, but never indiscriminately destructive, and when beams contacted a human, the effects were precise. Heat, pins and needles sensations, localized numbness, dizziness, and short-lived paralysis were common. Occasionally, officers themselves were struck lightly, experiencing subtle, strange fatigue afterward. Every report, sketch, and photograph captured something extraordinary. The team documented over 200 incidents during the operation's 2 phases. Maps were drawn, noting hotspots along rivers, mangroves, and coastal paths. Locations were repeated with uncanny consistency. In the villages, civilians began to recognize the officers' presence as another layer of observation, as if the military itself had become part of the nightly tableau of reassurance for some, a new tension for others. Then came the more puzzling encounters. Captain Hollander described seeing a humanoid figure, roughly 1.5 meters tall, clad in metallic attire that reflected the ambient light of the glowing objects. The being approached without haste, stopping several meters away, its posture calm, deliberate, and remarkably non-threatening. Hollander's account spoke of a communication not in words, but in presence, as if understanding could pass between beings without a single syllable. At the same time, he reported an object, small and unidentifiable, embedded in his arm, perceptible to touch, but invisible to conventional X-ray. Such encounters strained belief, even among those trained to witness the unusual. Meanwhile, villagers continued to provide detailed reports. Women who had seen lights hover near doorways, fishermen recounting beams skimming across boats, and children describing the orb's playful yet precise movements all contributed to a growing dossier. The operation was not merely about observation. It was about understanding an intelligence that interacted with humans, water, land, and the night itself. The cumulative effect on the officers was subtle but persistent. Fatigue from long hours of vigilance, combined with the uncanny experiences of light and presence, created an atmosphere of surreal attentiveness. Some officers began to question conventional explanations. Others focused purely on recording, yet none could deny the evidence accumulating before them. Dr. Welad Sesam Carvalho's medical analyses became invaluable. She was brought in to examine villagers affected by the beams during military observation. Burns, punctures, and anemia continued to present in patterns that eluded standard treatment. Blood tests consistently revealed drops in hemoglobin levels, sometimes severe, while neurological symptoms, dizziness, weakness, blurred vision remained, without clear cause. Even the military doctors recognized the anomaly. These were not accidents, and they were not hallucinations. Over the course of Operation Saucer, photographs and Super 8 films captured many incidents. Some images revealed glowing discs hovering above rivers. Others showed spheres emitting concentrated light over open fields. In sketches and logs, repeated patterns appeared. The same craft shapes, the same interactions with water, and the same deliberate targeting of individuals. These details, corroborated by hundreds of civilian testimonies, created a consistency that defied both skepticism and dismissal. And yet, despite the extensive documentation, a veil of restraint remained. Reports were filed in Brasilia footage, and photographs were archived, but not released. Conclusions were vague. Unusual aerial phenomena became the official language, a neutral phrase that explained nothing. Injuries, interactions, and the intelligence behind the lights were understated, carefully concealed from public scrutiny. The phenomena, observed with precision and diligence, was quietly reclassified into silence. Still, the effects on Colares were profound. Villages and military personnel alike returned to daily life. Altered by observation, memories lingered, subtle yet inescapable. Children slept differently. Fishermen navigated cautiously. Families gathered in tighter clusters, and even the officers, disciplined and rational, carried the imprint of nights spent under the glow of intelligent, enigmatic lights. The operation would leave behind a trove of material. Hundreds of photographs, oars of film, detailed maps, medical records, sketches, and reports that, while officially muted, held within them a startling narrative of interaction between humans and something beyond conventional understanding. And as the team packed up their cameras and returned to bases, the lights continued to hover, glide, and pulse over Colares, leaving the island itself suspended in a twilight between reality and revelation. Operation Sosa was more than an investigation. It was the first structured acknowledgement by a government that these phenomena existed, interacted, and sometimes caused harm. The Air Force had acted meticulously and cautiously, documenting a reality that the world was not yet ready to see. And in doing so, it left behind questions that would outlast every report, every photograph, and every interview. Questions about intelligence, intention, and the nature of the unknown itself. Even decades later, researchers, journalists, and ufologists would pore over these files, piecing together fragments, verifying sketches, and tracing patterns. Modern comparisons with UAP reports from the Pentagon and other international bodies revealed uncanny moves, similarities. The behaviors, the shapes, the water-based moves, they all hinted at a continuity, a phenomena that transcended time and location. Colares, once an isolated island in the Amazon Delta, had become a silent teacher of vigilance and wonder. Operation Saucer had cast the world's first structured, official eyes onto it, leaving humanity with proof sometimes subtle, sometimes vivid, that the night sky holds more than distance and starlight. It holds interaction, intelligence, mystery. The island returned to its rhythm, but nothing would ever feel entirely ordinary again. The villagers had learned to anticipate, observe, and endure. The officers had learned to question, document, and respect. And the lights continued to move as they had, unbound, graceful, inscrutable. And as the military files grew thicker and photographs multiplied, the world beyond Colares slowly stirred, curious, questioning, and unready for the truths that lay within. Chapter 7. Faces Under the Light. The nights on Colares had a rhythm, one that only the islanders truly understood. The moon would rise over the river, casting a silver shimmer across the mangroves, while the distant hum of insects merged with the soft lapping of the water. Families moved quietly from house to house, gathering together, not from whim but from necessity. A single person alone at night was a target, a fact that had settled into the collective consciousness like an unspoken rule. And yet, amid this vigilance, life persisted. Children played in the afternoons, fishermen rowed along calm waters, and women tended gardens, all under the watch of skies that could not be predicted, and lights that might descend at any hour. The villagers' stories were mosaic fragments of fear, wonder, and resilience. Donna Maria, a grandmother who had seen over 80 winters, recalled the first night she noticed something was wrong. She had been sitting by her door, sewing, when a greenish light hovered over the riverbank. It lingered with a patience that unsettled her more than its brilliance. The light tilted, as though observing her hands, her motions, even the small breath she drew. She could feel warmth radiating, a tingling that crept along her arms and left her muscles stiff. She whispered a prayer, though she did not expect the light to care. Still, it moved away slowly, as if satisfied that it had been seen. For Joachim, a young fisherman, the phenomenon was more intimate and more frightening. One evening, returning from a late fishing trip, a red beam traced along his boat. The air around him seemed to thicken, pressing softly, yet firmly, against his chest. His hands shook as he tried to secure the net, and a sudden dizziness made him grasp the boat's edges to steady himself. Days later, his hemoglobin levels dropped unexpectedly. The doctors said it was unusual. He told no one at first, fearful that sharing might invite shame or disbelief. But over time, like many others, he could not remain silent. The lights had a presence that demanded recognition. Children noticed the changes first. Their observations were precise, unclouded by explanation or fear of authority. Little Lena swore that the lights followed her dog, moving across the yard in colors that shifted from violet to amber, without warning. When the dog barked, the light pulsed almost rhythmically, as though responding. Ana's father, skeptical yet concerned, held his daughter close that night, noting the dog's unusual fatigue the next morning. Across the village, similar accounts circulated, animals trembling, disappearing temporarily, or exhibiting unexplained lethargy. Even the simplest activities carried risk. Cooking, bathing, or walking along the riverbank became exercises in mindfulness. Villagers learned to recognize signs. A sudden chill, a fleeting glow behind the trees, a shimmer along the water's surface. They moved with caution, speaking softly, and watching the sky as though it were an active participant in daily life. The Amazon Delta, a place of vast horizons and endless rivers, had transformed into an arena where human and otherworldly presences interacted, sometimes gently, sometimes insistently. The military's presence added another layer to this delicate dance. Officers patrolled alongside villagers, listening, observing, and occasionally intervening when beams appeared to close. Children hid behind them, seeking comfort in the uniforms, as though the men themselves were protective spirits. Conversations between villagers and officers were subdued, careful, often punctuated by long pauses as all parties considered the strange possibilities the night offered. The lines between witness, observer, and participant blurred, leaving everyone suspended in a shared vigilance. Not all encounters were sudden or aggressive. Some seemed almost contemplative, as if the lights were studying human behavior rather than harming it. Donna Maria described nights when the lights would hover silently over communal gatherings, observing fishermen smoking by the riverside, or families repairing their homes. No pain, no beams, just the intangible weight of attention. It was an awareness that made time slow, as if the village itself had become part of an experiment in perception. Yet the shadows of danger were never far. People reported brief, intense contact, a sudden red beam, a pressing warmth, a strange numbness that passed through the body and left lingering fatigue. Sometimes, puncture-like marks appeared on the skin, triangular in shape, clustering over arms, neck, or chest. Even the Air Force personnel were not immune. Captain Hollanday recalled the odd heaviness in his arm after observing a hovering craft, and Sergeant Costa noted a disorienting dizziness that lasted well into the morning. Families adapted, ritual by ritual. Bonfires burned along shorelines, not just for light, but for a sense of security. Dogs and cats were kept close. Children learned to stay within line of sight of elders. Women sang quietly as they worked, creating an audible thread that linked households across the village. Conversations carried a subtle tone, caution interwoven with curiosity, fear tempered by fascination. There was no hysteria here, only disciplined awareness, born from repeated, tangible encounters. Medical records confirmed what villagers felt. Dr. Waleed Sesam Carvalho's examinations painted a picture of subtle, yet persistent, physical effects. Blood tests revealed drops in hemoglobin, sometimes severe. Neurological symptoms, like dizziness, weakness, and blurred vision, were common. Skin burns appeared abruptly, sometimes almost instantly, and hair loss or insomnia lingered for weeks. These were not stories of imagination, they were manifestations of a force the human body struggled to comprehend. The lights were neither benign nor entirely destructive, but their presence left a clear imprint on flesh, mind, and environment. Animals continued to be affected. Dogs collapsed, birds fell from trees, and fish floated strangely near the river's surface. Trees and plants wilted or scorched in small, localized areas. Radios and electronics faltered during close encounters. The village ecosystem itself seemed to register the phenomenon's passage. It was as though the lights cast a ripple through the living and non-living alike, leaving evidence of influence wherever they moved. Among the most haunting aspects was the precision with which the phenomenon selected its interactions. Isolated individuals, fishermen returning alone, children wandering near shorelines were often the first to encounter a beam. Groups were less frequently targeted, suggesting a subtle, intelligent discernment. Villages began to notice patterns. The lights avoided certain homes, while circling others repeatedly. The Air Force observers documented similar behavior, reinforcing the idea that the lights were not random. They responded, adapted, and observed. Yet, amid the fear and caution, life endured. Villagers maintained routines as best they could. Meals were cooked over open flames. Children still ran barefoot through narrow paths, and the river remained the lifeblood of daily activity. They learned to recognize the signs, to respect the rhythm of the lights, and to navigate a world where nightfall brought not just darkness, but awareness. In doing so, they became part of the phenomenon's narrative, chroniclers of encounters that would one day intrigue the world. Captain Hollando reflected on these nights in later interviews. He described a mixture of awe and responsibility, the realization that the phenomenon was neither malevolent in intent nor entirely predictable. It tested boundaries, observed behavior, and left traces. But it also provided an unspoken opportunity for understanding. The villagers' courage in sharing their experiences, their willingness to endure and report, became as critical as the Air Force's formal documentation. Human persistence and observation were as much a part of the story as the lights themselves. By the conclusion of the operation, the cumulative experience of villagers and military personnel formed an extraordinary archive. Every encounter, every detail, every subtle shift in the river, the forest, and the air was recorded, sketched, or filmed. The phenomenon's presence was undeniable, consistent, and intelligent, leaving an imprint on those who lived through it. A mixture of unease, fascination, and a quiet, enduring vigilance. Even years later, recollections remained vivid. When families spoke of nights under the lights, their voices carried a calm awareness rather than panic. They recounted sequences of events, colors, movements, and sensations, with a precision that reflected repeated exposure and deep attentiveness. And as new generations listened, these memories became more than stories. They became inherited knowledge, a guide to navigating a world in which the sky itself might reach down to observe, interact, and influence life on the river. Through it all, the lights remained enigmatic. They hovered, pulsed, and glided without explanation. They seemed alive, yet not bound by conventional definitions of life. They interacted, yet rarely harmed intentionally. They illuminated the island with strange colors, reshaping perceptions, altering behavior, and leaving physical traces that defied ordinary understanding. And above all, they were witnessed by villagers, by Air Force officers, and by history itself. Colares was no longer just an island in the Amazon Delta. It had become a living memory, a tapestry woven from human experience, courage, and the quiet persistence of a phenomenon that challenged comprehension. The village's faces under the lights were testimonies, evidence of a world in which observation, awareness, and endurance mattered as much as curiosity, wonder, and the subtle acknowledgement of the unknown. The story of Colares was not simply one of lights and fear. It was a story of human resilience, of quiet vigilance, and of the delicate interplay between ordinary life and extraordinary experience. And in that interplay, the world learned slowly, deliberately, that the night sky could touch, shape, and imprint the lives of those who dared to live beneath it. As the villagers adapted and memories solidified, the phenomenon's echoes stretched beyond Colares, whispering hints of truths yet to be revealed. Chapter 8. Shadows in the Records. By the time Operation Saucer had begun its second phase, the nights on Colares had taken on a new rhythm, one that blended vigilance with exhaustion, anticipation with unease. The islanders had learned to listen for subtle cues: a sudden shift in the wind, a faint glimmer across the river, the unusual rustle of leaves in the mangrove. Every movement in the dark seemed imbued with significance. And now, alongside the villagers, the Air Force officers were watching, recording, documenting, and quietly grappling with the impossible. Captain Uran Bolivar Ojanda Lima carried his notebook like a shield and a key. Each night, he would stand along the riverbank, binoculars fixed, pen poised. He recorded everything: the direction of lights, the shape and speed of the objects, the exact moments when beams contacted a body, and the reactions of the villagers. The records were meticulous, almost ritualistic. Every detail mattered, because in Colares, small details could reveal patterns invisible to casual observation. Medical documentation became an unexpected bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Dr. Waylaid, Sesam Carvalho's notes were precise, clinical, and yet infused with the weight of human suffering. She could not fully explain. Burns appeared abruptly, triangular and clustered. Hemoglobin levels fell sharply. In otherwise healthy adults, neurological symptoms lingered: dizziness, insomnia, nausea. She recorded all of it with a professionalism that never obscured the strange patterns. Her patients trusted her, and in return, she treated each case as both medicine and testimony. The Air Force began to compile a library of images and sketches. They photographed luminous objects hovering above rooftops, mapped their trajectories over the rivers and mangroves, and created detailed diagrams of the village's layout in relation to the sightings. There were hundreds of sketches showing discs, cylinders, glowing spheres, and shapes that defied immediate classification. Officers noted repetition. Across different areas, certain configurations of lights and movement appeared again and again, as if the phenomenon adhered to a set of rules only it understood. One night, Sergeant Joe Flavio de Freitas Costa observed something that would remain etched in his memory. A glowing orb descended slowly over the river, hovering for what felt like an eternity. Its light pulsed in shades of blue and violet, and then, unexpectedly, it split into smaller spheres that danced over the water's surface. Costa film camera, word as he captured the movements, yet even as the images would later be examined, the sense of uncanny coordination was almost impossible to convey. The orb and its satellites responded to environmental cues, moving with intention, slowing when approached, retreating when agitated. The villagers' own accounts reinforced the officers' observations. Joaquim, the young fisherman, described beams that seemed to target specific individuals, following them with remarkable persistence. Donna Maria noticed lights hovering above her home, retreating when she shouted, yet returning minutes later, almost as though testing boundaries. Children spoke of small, hovering spheres that moved in sync with their footsteps, sometimes pausing as if observing, sometimes accelerating like playful shadows. Scientific theories began to collide with lived experience. Some Air Force engineers suggested atmospheric plasma, rare electrical phenomena, or reflections caused by high humidity and magnetic anomalies. Others considered psychological explanations: masks, hysteria, stress-induced hallucinations, cultural influence. But neither theory could account for the combination of physical evidence, consistent witness descriptions, and the repeated patterns observed across multiple locations. The phenomenon defied neat categorization. Captain Halanda himself encountered moments that challenged both science and faith. On one patrol along a narrow river channel, he reported a humanoid figure approximately 1.5 meters tall, clad in a metallic suit, standing silently on the water's edge. The being made no sudden movements, yet Halanda described an awareness in its posture, a quiet intelligence that radiated calm. Later, he claimed an object was implanted in his arm, perceptible to touch but invisible on X-rays. Every recorded encounter carried echoes beyond the immediate moment. Animals reacted instinctively. Dogs whimpered or collapsed. Birds fluttered erratically. Fish leapt from the water in confusion. Vegetation near sightings showed unusual scorch marks, while radios and other electronics faltered or emitted strange sounds. Even when humans were not directly in the path of the lights, the environment itself seemed to respond, as though the phenomenon left a subtle signature on the ecosystem. Amid these strange events, the military maintained a disciplined approach. Observers documented and reported, sketching, filming, and filing each occurrence with precision. Yet the recordings themselves posed questions. What could explain the sharp rectangle turns, the sudden accelerations, or the submersions into rivers? The objects did not conform to any known technology or natural law, and the Air Force, while methodical, faced a growing realization that understanding the phenomena might lie beyond conventional reasoning. By December, the files had grown heavy with evidence. Hundreds of photographs, hours of film, dozens of sketches, and countless witness testimonies formed a dense tapestry of encounters. Each entry, however, carried a weight. Beyond the mere act of recording it was a testimony to a reality that challenged assumptions about space, perception, and the limits of human knowledge. Officers, villagers, and scientists alike began to sense that they were witnessing something profound, a force or presence that operated on its own terms, quietly yet insistently altering the known world. The documentation also revealed subtle patterns. Lights favored certain areas, avoided others, and exhibited behavior that suggested awareness. Beams appeared to interact selectively, and objects often demonstrated synchronized movements that hinted at coordination or intelligence. Observers speculated about communication, experimentation, or observation, but no single hypothesis could account for the totality of experience. Even in the administrative records, the human element was present. Officers noted their own fatigue, their OB, their unease. Villagers' resilience was documented, not merely as anecdote, but as measurable behavior, adaptations to routines, collective responses to danger, and the emergence of new cultural practices in response to nightly uncertainty. The records themselves became part of the story, a reflection of how ordinary lives were intertwined with phenomena that defied comprehension. Decades later, researchers would revisit these archives with fresh eyes. Declassified documents, interviews, and film would allow a broader audience to glimpse what the Brazilian Air Force observed firsthand. The documentation's consistency, combined with the physical and psychological effects on witnesses, provided an extraordinary case study in how human experience can intersect with the unexplainable. Yet the files also preserved mysteries that remain unsolved. Videos and photographs captured shapes and movements that remain difficult to interpret. Notes described sensations, interactions, and anomalies that no contemporary science could fully explain. Patterns suggested strategy, discernment, and awareness, and the human witnesses, the villagers, the officers, the medical professionals, left an enduring record of adaptation, observation, and cautious curiosity. Operation Sosa's meticulous records offered more than data. They offered perspective. They revealed how communities confronted the unknown, how individuals maintained dignity and routine under scrutiny, and how human observation can create a framework to understand phenomena that resist simple explanation. The Air Force's work, careful and disciplined, transformed anecdotal encounters into documented history, providing a bridge between personal experience and collective knowledge. Medical evidence complemented the military records. Dr. Carvalho's report showed patterns that could not be ignored. Burns appearing suddenly, blood anomalies, neurological symptoms. Witnesses described the sensations of beams touching skin, producing discomfort, weakness, and dizziness. These phenomena, repeatedly documented, underscored the tangible consequences of interaction with something neither human nor fully natural. Even as the operation concluded, the shadows in the records persisted. The lights had left traces on paper, film, and memory. They had etched themselves into the island's environment, into villagers' routines, into officers' notebooks, and into history itself. And in those shadows, questions lingered. What were the true intentions behind these interactions? Were they deliberate, benign, curious, or a combination of all three? Could patterns observed in Colares be extrapolated to other regions, times, or phenomena? Colares was no longer simply a point on a map. Through its records, sketches, and testimony, it had become a locus of understanding and mystery. The documents preserved the night, the river, the mangroves, and the faces beneath the lights, ensuring that the quiet, meticulous observations of 1977 could echo across decades. The shadows in the records carried meaning far beyond immediate comprehension, inviting inquiry, reflection, and humility. And perhaps most importantly, these records reminded those who studied them that the unknown, when approached with patience, respect, and careful attention, does not always demand fear. It demands awareness. It invites curiosity. It asks that those who witness it listen with eyes, mind, and heart attuned to nuance, subtlety, and pattern. Colares, through its files, photos, and testimony, became a silent teacher, showing that the unknown interacts, that observation matters, and that understanding is often a patient, deliberate pursuit rather than a hurried conclusion. In the village, in the river, and in the Air Force archives, the lights had left traces of knowledge fleeting, profound, and enduring. As the documents revealed patterns and evidence, the story deepened, beckoning us toward theories and understanding that stretched far beyond Colares itself. Chapter 9. Theories and Speculations. By the time the officers had returned to their stations with notebooks, full and cameras brimming with images, the islanders of Colares had begun to whisper not just of fear, but of questions. They asked each other why the lights came, what they wanted, and whether they would return. The children, too, carried quiet stories, recounting the shimmer of orbs, the warmth of beams, and the moments when a single glowing sphere seemed to watch them tiptoe past a riverbank. These were not stories invented in fear. They were precise recollections, repeated in households and markets, across firesides and docks. The officers and the villagers, scientists and doctors, began to wrestle with interpretation. What could these lights be? Were they natural, artificial, or something entirely beyond human conception? Some suggested atmospheric plasma, the kind that can appear to float, move unpredictably, or even interact with surroundings. Perhaps, they said, this was a rare electrical phenomenon, enhanced by the humid air and magnetic currents of the Amazon Delta. And yet, the accounts did not fully align. Plasma does not target individuals. It does not respond to attempts at avoidance or engagement. It does not leave behind burns, puncture marks, or sudden drops in hemoglobin. Others turned toward human technology, imagining secret experiments, clandestine testing of equipment, so advanced that only a handful of engineers could understand it. Could the lights have been probes, surveillance devices, perhaps early attempts at directed energy tools, carefully deployed in remote areas to avoid public notice? Yet even this explanation faltered under scrutiny. Objects moved underwater. They reacted to observers' actions. They demonstrated coordination and intelligence. No known aircraft or weapon behaved with such fluid awareness, and the very presence of humans seemed to affect their movement. As theories spread, some scientists and ufologists proposed extraterrestrial visitation. They pointed to consistent patterns, precise beams targeting individuals, objects moving with intention, humanoid figures observed alongside the crafts, and the recurring types of vehicles: discs, cylinders, spheres, and forms that defied traditional engineering. Supporters of this theory imagined intelligence beyond our comprehension, a presence quietly studying, sampling, or interacting with human life. The beings, they suggested, were not necessarily hostile, yet the effects: burns, weakness, and even death posed questions that could not be ignored. The phenomena is intelligence, if it could be called that, seemed selective. Individuals were observed repeatedly, sometimes isolated, sometimes in groups, and sometimes in complex sequences involving both light and movement. Witnesses noted the responsiveness of the objects, retreating when fired upon, reacting to lights, hovering with purpose, splitting into smaller orbs, or merging together like living shapes. These were not chaotic movements. They were coordinated, deliberate, and occasionally almost playful. Psychological explanations were raised carefully, sometimes gently, sometimes skeptically. Could fear, isolation, and community storytelling amplify perception? Could sleep deprivation, stress, or suggestion create shared hallucinations? Certainly, stress and fear played a role. Communities, under repeated disturbance, naturally developed heightened vigilance, but no psychological framework could explain the physical evidence. Burns did not disappear with reassurance. Blood levels did not normalize with calm. Animals were affected independently of cultural expectation. Even trained military observers reported interactions that were neither imagined nor easily dismissed. Among the researchers who examined the records, Jock Valley and others proposed a subtler idea, that the phenomenon was a form of intelligence not constrained by human expectations. Perhaps it adapted, appeared differently depending on observer, and engaged in a manner that was perceptive, responsive, and yet incomprehensible. In this view, objects might appear as glowing spheres, structured craft, or humanoid forms, not because they were one or the other, but because they were something that interacted with perception itself. This notion challenged the binary thinking of alien or human, suggesting instead that intelligence might manifest in ways entirely outside conventional materiality. Medical researchers, meanwhile, focused on understanding patterns that could be quantified. Burns, punctures, anemia, and neurological symptoms all hinted at some form of directed interaction. Jock Valley and other analysts considered energy effects similar to microwaves or electromagnetic radiation, capable of interacting with biological tissue without leaving conventional explanations. Yet even with these hypotheses, the broader intent or purpose of the phenomenon remained elusive. The mystery deepened with the Air Force officers' personal accounts. Captain Hollanda's testimony of a humanoid figure and a possible implant created tension between skepticism and belief. Some colleagues dismissed it as stress or suggestion. Others recorded it carefully, recognizing that it aligned with the broader, unexplained patterns observed nightly across multiple villages. The files, sketches, photographs, and film contained corroborating details that lent credibility to accounts that might otherwise have seemed extraordinary. As these threads intertwined, a tapestry of speculation emerged. The lights could be plasma, yet behave intelligently. They could be human technology, yet surpass in known capabilities. They could be extraterrestrial, yet leave humans physically affected. They could represent a type of consciousness not bound to matter as we understand it. The key was that no single theory encompassed all observed behaviors. Each offered insight, but none offered finality. The villagers themselves began to adjust. They developed routines, patterns of observation, and methods of protection. They slept in groups, lit fires, and created noise not out of ritual or superstition, but as adaptive responses to repeated experience. In these adjustments, one could see the human mind at work, observing, learning, responding, and surviving. The phenomenon became a teacher of vigilance, adaptation, and awareness. In modern terms, Colares represents a nexus where multiple forms of evidence intersect. Human perception, physical traces, scientific records, and psychological response. Each lens offers part of the truth, yet only by considering them together can the story emerge. The lights, the effects, and the documentation are not merely curiosities. They form a case study in how unknown phenomena engage with society, with biology, and with perception itself. Theories continued to multiply, some grounded in physics, others in anthropology, psychology, or ufology. Each offered a different angle, a way to explain partial observations, to rationalize the inexplicable, or to impose order on uncertainty. Yet the island of Colares retained its own narrative, independent of theory. One of nightly observation, cautious curiosity, and lives quietly transformed. The investigation's documentation became both record and relic. Every sketch, photograph, and report carried layers of human experience. AW, fear, fatigue, and determination. Even decades later, researchers could feel the tension of those nights, the careful attention of observers, and the subtle patterns in the recorded data. The evidence suggested intelligence responsive, deliberate, and interactive, yet the meaning remained ungraspable, teasing the boundaries of comprehension. In the end, the theories and speculations revealed as much about the observers as the observed. They highlighted the human need to explain two categories and to understand phenomena that defy simple explanation. Yet they also emphasized humility. Some truths might remain beyond human grasp, not because they are inaccessible, but because their logic operates on principles unfamiliar to us. Colares, in this light, became a quiet reminder of wonder, restraint, and observation. The lights were not just a spectacle, they were a challenge to perception, a prompt to curiosity, and an invitation to recognize the limits of understanding. Whether one leans toward extraterrestrial intelligence, experimental technology, atmospheric phenomena, or consciousness beyond matter, the phenomena demanded attention, careful documentation, and thoughtful reflection. And so, in the shadows of the records, the lights of Colares persisted. They were patterns, interactions, and experiences preserved in the meticulous work of villagers and officers alike. They offered lessons in observation, in patience, and in the willingness to accept that some mysteries might remain open, not diminished by speculation, but enhanced by the human endeavor to understand. The lights, the beams, the hum of the river, and the rustle of mangroves all became part of a story larger than any single witness, a story that bridged communities, generations, and fields of study. Theories came and went, yet the essence of Colares, the interplay of light, intelligence, and human experience remained. Quietly persistent, waiting for reflection, patience, and a willingness to accept ambiguity as part of the narrative. In Colares, every light had a lesson, every beam a question, and every shadowed record a hint of something beyond immediate understanding. And for those who studied them, listened, and recorded, the experience became a form of communion with the unknown, a patient dialogue between what is seen, what is known, and what remains elusive. With theories and speculations circling, the story moves deeper into personal accounts, revealing how individuals coped, adapted, and internalized the phenomenon. Chapter 10. Personal Encounters and Human Response. Even in the quietest corners of Colares, the phenomenon had a way of asserting presence. It was not always visible. Sometimes it manifested as a subtle warmth on the skin, a sudden shadow that moved against the breeze, or a flicker at the edge of vision. Yet those who lived there learned quickly that the lights did not always announce themselves gently. They arrived in a way that forced attention, drawing the observer into a delicate negotiation of awareness and action. Take, for instance, the fisherman returning along the river after a long day. He walked slowly, boots sinking slightly into the wet sand, net slung over his shoulder. The evening was calm, the sky deepening from blue to navy, and for a moment it seemed that all was ordinary. Then a small, glowing orb appeared, hovering just above the water. It did not cast a shadow, but its presence was tangible, a heat that brushed against the skin, a pull at the chest, a sudden tightening in the chest that made each breath deliberate. The fisherman paused, leaning on his net, eyes wide yet unblinking. He did not scream. There was no time. He watched as the orb shifted closer, tilting slightly, almost inquisitively. Then, as if satisfied by observation alone, it receded, dissolving into the night like smoke. Children experienced it differently. One little girl, barely taller than the wooden fence surrounding her home, spoke of the lights as if they were playful companions. She would step out at twilight, holding a small lantern, and describe spheres that mirrored her movements, orbiting around her before vanishing when the first stars appeared. Her parents watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. They marveled at her calm, yet they whispered among themselves, wondering how to reconcile her wonder with the reports of burns and illness that had visited older villagers. Women who moved along the riverbanks carried a different set of experiences. They spoke of beams that grazed their shoulders, of moments when the air felt heavier, as though something unseen pressed gently yet insistently. One woman described a sensation of her strength being lifted, leaving her knees soft and trembling. She leaned on a tree, gripping its bark, feeling the warmth ebb as the light retreated. Days later, she would report fatigue that no rest could cure. There were no visible injuries, yet her body seemed subtly altered, as if a small piece of energy had been removed and replaced with an echo of emptiness. Doctors like Dr. Weladi, Sesam Carvalho treated these patients with meticulous care. She observed patterns, documenting the burns, the puncture marks, the anemia. She noted how some patients described sensations almost impossible to articulate. A tingling, a gentle yet insistent pressure, a feeling that something intangible had passed through them and left a trace. For her, the phenomenon was not abstract. It had a measurable, observable footprint on the body. She did not speak of spirits or imagination. She spoke of changes in hemoglobin levels, the sudden onset of weakness, and the peculiar clustering of marks on the skin, often triangular, sometimes paired, always precise. Even the animals were affected. Dogs that wandered too close to the banks at night returned trembling, or sometimes did not return at all. Birds would scatter from trees without a sound, returning hours later as if nothing had occurred. Yet nests were occasionally found scorched or broken. Cats avoided certain areas entirely, crouching low to the ground, ears pressed back, following unseen rhythms that guided their behavior. In these reactions, the phenomenon's influence extended beyond humans, encompassing the living landscape itself. Entire households adapted. Families began sleeping together, combining homes into small clusters of safety. Fires burned along shorelines to deter approach, though whether the light responded to the flames was uncertain. Guns were fired not in celebration, but as a measure of psychological defense. Parents instructed children to remain close, to walk in pairs, to avoid venturing near the river alone after dusk. Life became a careful choreography between the ordinary and the extraordinary, a dance with uncertainty that required attention, patience, and courage. Even so, fear did not eliminate curiosity. People noted patterns. Lights often appeared on moonless nights, along river bends, and near mangrove clusters. They observed that certain gestures, moving slowly, speaking softly, avoiding direct confrontations, sometimes influenced the object's behavior. In these small interactions, one could see a form of dialogue forming, unspoken but understood. Humans adapted, the lights adapted, and through observation, both learned something about the other. Military observers, too, documented these encounters with precise detail. Captain Halanda said Gent Costa and their team recorded incidents using cameras, maps, and logs. They observed objects hovering silently, splitting into smaller orbs, or performing sudden directional shifts that no conventional aircraft could manage. They noted that the light seemed aware of their attention, sometimes retreating when approached, sometimes returning when ignored. The documentation captured not only the event, but the subtle human response. The tightening of hands on binoculars, the pause before calling out, the careful measurement of time and distance. Even in these structured observations, unpredictability remained. Beams sometimes struck without warning, leaving a sensation of warmth and pressure. Vegetation near encounter sites withered subtly. Electronics malfunctioned, and water surfaces shimmered as if energized by unseen currents. Humans were witnesses, but not always participants. And yet, every encounter left them altered, a heightened awareness, a lingering memory, a quiet vigilance that persisted even in daylight. The phenomenon did not adhere to schedules. Nights with no events were followed by multiple encounters, sometimes clustered, sometimes spread across villages. It was neither random nor wholly predictable. Observers learned to track subtle signs, shifts in wind, the sudden silence of animals, the faint glow on the horizon. This attention to detail became part of daily life, a continuous practice of mindful observation that intertwined with routine survival. In families, elders shared guidance with younger members, blending caution with storytelling. Move slowly when the lights appear, they would advise, and do not fear their presence. Watch, but respect them. Stories were repeated, not to frighten, but to instill awareness. Children internalized these lessons with ease, navigating the night with careful, attentive steps. Even the smallest gestures, a hand raised to shield eyes, a pause at the edge of the water, became acts of negotiation. part of the silent contract between observer and phenomenon. Medical records continued to provide insight, reinforcing the reality of physical impact. Patients presented with fatigue, dizziness, and burns, yet also described sensations of fascination and wonder. Many found themselves drawn to observe, compelled to notice patterns, to record details, to reconcile the extraordinary with the ordinary. The human mind, it seemed, could hold both fear and fascination simultaneously, a duality reflected in the collective response of the communities. As weeks passed, the interplay between humans and lights evolved into something more profound. It was not mere survival, nor simple documentation, but a shared experience of existence at the edge of understanding. Humans observed, learned, and adapted. The lights responded, hovered, and withdrew. Together, they formed a temporary ecosystem of perception and presence, each influencing the other in ways subtle and ineffable. In the quiet moments before dawn, when fires burned low and the river reflected only the first hints of light, people said. They noticed details often missed in the daytime bustle, a shimmer along the water's edge, a faint glow among the mangroves, the way shadows stretched differently when the orbs moved above. These moments became rituals of attention, of patience, and of wonder. The lights, though unknown in origin and intent, had become teachers in observation, guiding humans to a new awareness of their environment and themselves. Through these experiences, the phenomenon revealed its complexity. It was not simply a threat, nor simply a spectacle. It was an ongoing interaction, a form of engagement that required humans to refine perception, heighten attention, and embrace uncertainty with curiosity rather than panic. Lives were altered, not only by the physical effects, but by the lessons embedded in careful observation, by the quiet rhythm of existence at the interface of the known and unknown. Even decades later, when researchers and ufologists reviewed testimonies, the patterns remained consistent. AAC account. Each documented effect revealed a continuum of human response. Vigilance, adaptation, recording, reflection, and adaptation again. The phenomenon had become a silent collaborator in the shaping of perception, encouraging attentiveness, awareness, and respect for forces beyond immediate comprehension. And so, in Colares, life continued in tandem with the lights. Families walked cautiously but freely. Children played with an understanding that extended beyond fear, and communities observed the sky with a patient curiosity that blended wonder, vigilance, and resilience. Every encounter added to a growing tapestry of experience, creating a living record of human adaptation to the extraordinary. In the narrative of Colares, the lights were teachers, the villagers were students, and the river, mangroves, and night sky were the classroom. The lessons were subtle but enduring. Observe carefully, respect the unknown, and embrace the interplay of curiosity and caution. As the human response unfolded, the phenomenon's influence extended beyond physical effects, shaping culture, memory, and the very rhythm of daily life on the island. Chapter 11. Broader patterns in regional spread. By the time the early months of 1977 passed, the phenomenon no longer felt contained. The lights, which had first hovered over the isolated streets of Colares, now seemed to ripple outward, extending their presence into neighboring villages along the Paradelta. Families in Mosquero, Baía do Sol, Vigia, and beyond began reporting sightings that mirrored those of Colares, almost as if the sky itself had begun repeating its quiet, deliberate, a thoughtful lesson. The first signs were subtle. A fisherman returning from the northern riverbank noted a faint shimmer hovering over a mangrove cluster. At first, he thought it was a reflection of the moon, distorted by mist rising from the water. But the shimmer moved independently, darting around the dense foliage, before settling above his small canoe. It remained still for several heartbeats, and in that suspended moment, he could feel a soft pressure on his chest, a warmth that wasn't uncomfortable but undeniable. When the light finally receded, he arrived home hours later, carrying not only fish, but a sense of having witnessed something that would not be forgotten. Across the delta, similar encounters unfolded, often with patterns that seemed deliberate. Small, glowing orbs appeared along river bends, often choosing moments when individuals were isolated, whether walking home with a basket of supplies or standing by a lantern-lit path. The lights moved with subtle intelligence, hovering, retreating, and returning in ways that suggested observation rather than random drift. Families began to notice that these encounters were not bound by geography alone, but by timing. Certain nights, especially those with cloudless skies, brought multiple incidents simultaneously, across miles of river, as though the phenomenon orchestrated a symphony of illumination. Observers began to chart these movements instinctively, creating mental maps of risk and safety. Parents taught children to recognize early signs: the sudden hush of animals, the shimmering reflections on water, the peculiar glow against leaves that otherwise seemed black in the night. Fishermen adjusted routines, leaving earlier or returning later, depending on reports from neighboring villages. Even those who had initially approached the phenomenon with casual curiosity found themselves adopting careful, deliberate patterns of behavior, guided by intuition as much as by caution. It wasn't just the villages themselves that experienced this shift. Larger stretches of the Amazon, typically isolated and dense, became silent witnesses to the phenomenon's subtle expansion. Traders moving between towns reported objects following them along the river, sometimes darting in front of canoes, sometimes skimming above treetops with an almost imperceptible hum. Even towns further inland, distant from the coast, recorded rare but uncanny appearances, suggesting that the lights had a reach broader than anyone could immediately comprehend. As these patterns unfolded, the Brazilian Air Force began to sense the phenomenon's regional scale. Reports arriving from multiple communities painted a picture of an event that transcended localized occurrences. Military records later revealed that officers noticed clusters of sightings forming along rivers, marshes, and coastal inlets, often with the same behaviors documented in Colares. Hovering, emitting precise beams of colored light, reacting to movement, and affecting both humans and animals. Each report reinforced the reality that this was not isolated, and that the lights seemed to operate with consistent rules, though the purpose of those rules remained entirely opaque. Communities themselves adapted to the regional spread. Villages shared warnings, often by word of mouth, across the waterways. Nets were left untended at night. Fires were kept burning along shorelines, and families slept together in tightly packed groups. The phenomenon was no longer a local curiosity. It had become a shared experience, a regional rhythm that connected villages in subtle ways. Children recounted observations to neighbors' children, reinforcing patterns of vigilance and respect. Elderly villagers taught younger generations the gestures and movements that seemed to draw the light's attention or encourage them to withdraw. In this quiet, collective adaptation, the phenomenon shaped both daily life and cultural memory. Medical practitioners began to note similarities across villages. Symptoms reported in Vigia mirrored those first documented in Colares: sudden burns, unexplained anemia, fatigue, and hair loss. Dr. Wilaid Sessom Carvalho's colleagues, when consulted by distant families, recorded analogous patterns, confirming that the physical effects were not limited to one small island. These patterns elevated concern. The phenomenon had the capacity to affect widespread populations, and it did so with subtlety rather than overt violence. Eyewitness testimonies also revealed remarkable consistencies. Shapes of objects, descriptions of beams, and behaviors of lights matched nearly perfectly across communities. Some reported discs with small windows, others observed spherical or cylindrical forms, and a few described elongated shapes reminiscent of barrels or domes. Witnesses consistently noted that the lights seemed selective, often focusing on isolated individuals or small groups. The precision of interaction was unsettling. Unlike random natural phenomena, these lights appeared to know whom or what to observe. Animals, too, continued to respond in similar ways across the delta. Dogs and cats avoided certain paths. Birds scattered before the lights appeared, and even livestock displayed subtle signs of unease, moving restlessly in pens or refusing to graze near riverbanks at night. The ecosystem itself seemed attuned to the phenomenon's presence, and villagers quickly learned to interpret these reactions as additional early warning signals. Communication networks between villages evolved quietly. While there were no radios capable of constant contact, word of mouth became a lifeline. Fishermen returning from long trips would share encounters with neighboring families, creating informal logs of activity. These reports sometimes matched military observations. strengthening the notion that the phenomenon operated on a scale beyond the comprehension of any single observer. The patterning was undeniable. Occurrences clustered along water systems, particularly rivers and mangroves, suggesting that the natural landscape itself guided the light's movement. The region's social fabric also reflected these new patterns. Families huddled in communal spaces. Local ceremonies incorporated elements to appease or understand the phenomenon, and cultural memory began to encode the light's behavior into stories, songs, and informal teachings. The phenomenon, though extraordinary, became integrated into the rhythm of life, shaping not only daily activities, but also the collective imagination. By the time reports reached major towns and military outposts, a clear regional trend had emerged. It was no longer a question of isolated events. This was a distributed, patterned, and observable presence that spanned the delta. The lights followed rivers, clustered near mangroves, and appeared repeatedly in the same locations across weeks and months. These patterns suggested intelligence, or at least deliberate behavior, challenging conventional explanations based solely on natural or atmospheric phenomena. Even distant researchers and ufologists began to take note. Patterns drawn from witness reports allowed analysts to map corridors of activity, revealing a network of light activity that appeared to ripple across the Amazon, like a slow, deliberate pulse. Connections between communities became apparent, and a regional framework emerged. The lights did not drift aimlessly. They moved with intention, following rivers, coastlines, and clusters of human activity. Through all of this, the people of the region continued to respond with patience and careful observation. While fear was present, it never fully dominated. Curiosity, vigilance, and adaptation balanced the anxiety. Families adjusted routines, shared knowledge, and practiced forms of gentle protection. Observers noted subtle cues from the lights, refined movements, and communicated strategies across villages. In this way, human resilience and awareness became intertwined with the phenomenon, each informing the other in a quiet, persistent dance of recognition and respect. By late 1977, the regional spread of sightings had made it impossible to ignore the phenomenon. The lights were no longer a local curiosity or an isolated concern. They had become a persistent presence across the Paradelta, a subtle yet undeniable pattern that reached across waterways, villages, and ecosystems. The phenomenon was not merely observed. It was engaged with, studied in real time, and integrated into the rhythm of human life. And yet, despite the consistency of reports, the phenomenon's origin, purpose, and full scope remained elusive. Each new observation deepened mystery rather than resolved it. Patterns emerged, but the underlying intent remained hidden. The more people observed, recorded, and adapted, the more apparent it became that the lights were not merely passive. They were part of an intricate, living system that intersected with human experience, demanding awareness, respect, and careful attention. As the phenomenon extended beyond Colares, its presence reshaped not just villages, but the broader understanding of what might inhabit the skies, setting the stage for deeper investigation and reflection. Chapter 12. Operation Saucer Deep Dive in Military Records. By late October 1977, the skies above the Paradelta had begun to carry a weight that could no longer be ignored. The scattered reports, once whispered from one village to another, had coalesced into an unmistakable chorus. The lights were real, persistent, and interacting in ways that defied ordinary explanation. Families slept together in church halls. Fishermen refused to sail at night, and local physicians continued to treat mysterious burns and unusual anemia. In the midst of this growing unease, the Brazilian government responded not with denial, but with deliberate observation. It began with a formal request from José Odon Fabucho Sowiro, the mayor of Colares. His appeal was simple yet urgent. The local authorities were overwhelmed, and the phenomenon was no longer a village problem. It was a matter that required federal intervention. What arrived in response was Operation Saucer, or Operação Prato em Portuguese, a classified military initiative designed to observe, document, and understand the lights that had so quietly invaded the Amazonian nights. Captain Jurang Bolivar Holanda Lima led the operation on the ground. From the outset, He approached his task with skepticism, expecting misidentifications and local hysteria. Yet skepticism soon gave way to disbelief as the team, equipped with cameras, binoculars, film equipment, radios, and measuring tools, documented events that challenged the limits of explanation. Each night, they stationed themselves along rivers, shorelines, and villages, standing side by side with wary civilians, who had long since learned to anticipate the light's presence. The first observations were subtle. A glowing orb would emerge above the mangroves, shifting colors between blue, green, and red, hovering with a grace that seemed deliberate. At times, these lights descended to tree level, stopping inches above rooftops, before retreating with astonishing speed. In other instances, beams of light shot from the objects, cutting through the darkness with laser-like precision. Witnesses, including military personnel, described a sensation of heat, of energy drawn away, of sudden weakness. Arwelade sesam carvalus. Reports, already circulating among the operations medical team, confirmed that these were not hallucinations. Burns appeared almost instantly. Puncture marks were observed in distinct geometric patterns, and anemia was recorded in otherwise healthy adults. As the nights stretched on, the patterns became clearer. Objects were rarely solitary. Groups of lights moved with synchronized precision, sometimes appearing above the same river bends repeatedly, as if following a hidden map. Some would skim across water surfaces, submerging briefly before re-emerging in a glow beneath the currents. Others reacted to human interference. Gunshots, flares, or spotlights would prompt rapid retreat, only for the objects to return moments later, sometimes in greater numbers, or with enhanced intensity. Captain Hollanda documented these behaviors meticulously. Sketches captured discs, barrels, spheres, domes, and elongated shapes, each replicated across independent observations. The presence of smaller, companion orbs suggested a level of coordination, an intelligence capable of intricate movement. In private logs, he recorded the most unsettling incidents. Individuals lifted by gusts of cold wind, light beams concentrating on isolated villagers, and even moments when humanoid figures were glimpsed within the objects. One account, later revealed to the public, years after the operation, described a small figure, clad in a reflective suit, communicating with calm intent and image that would challenge conventional understanding of UFO encounters for decades. The military also collected photographs and Super 8 film, documenting hundreds of encounters across more than 30 communities. Maps were drawn, marking rivers, mangroves, and coastal inlets where activity repeated. Over 500 photographs, hours of film detailed sketches, and formal reports created a web of evidence that left no doubt among the team. The phenomenon was persistent, systematic, and intelligent. Yet, despite the wealth of documentation, the official summary sent to Brasilia was strikingly vague. The events were labeled unusual phenomena, a phrase that neither conveyed the seriousness of injuries nor acknowledged the sophisticated behaviors observed. Footage and images were largely withheld, and detailed medical records were summarized without explicit explanation. The operation, while thorough, concluded publicly with an unsettling silence. 4 years, Operation Saucer remained classified. Rumors circulated among ufologists, journalists, and former military personnel, but concrete evidence was locked away, leaving the world to wonder. It wasn't until the 1990s that researchers like J. Gavierd and Marco Ant Neopetit tracked down Captain Hollanda, whose interviews confirmed the reality of what the Air Force had witnessed. He revealed encounters beyond ordinary explanation, objects submerging into rivers, precise targeting of civilians, and even personal experiences with mysterious implants. Declassified documents, released sporadically from 2004 through the 2020s, provided partial glimpses into the operation's findings. Hundreds of pages, detailed observations, medical reports, sketches, and witness statements. These documents revealed a phenomenon that was neither fleeting nor random. It interacted with its environment and with humans in ways that left a measurable impact. Yet, even these releases withheld the most compelling evidence. Full video footage, detailed maps of object movement, and sensitive personal accounts. The phenomenon's reach and intelligence were undeniable. Villages across Para Maranhão and Aker reported consistent experiences: burns, anemia, hair loss, unusual fatigue, and strange puncture marks. Animals reacted similarly in multiple regions, and electronic devices malfunctioned near sightings. The operation's medical records, combined with civilian observations, suggested effects that resembled directed energy exposure, an observation later reinforced by independent researchers. Despite the careful documentation, skepticism remained. Critics proposed mass hysteria, folklore, or misidentification of natural phenomena, yet these explanations struggled to account for the physical evidence. Burns, abnormal blood tests, animal deaths, and coordinated behaviors that were consistent across independent locations. The phenomenon, while mysterious, was tangible. Its effects were recorded, its patterns mapped, and its presence corroborated by trained military observers. Operation Saucer also illuminated a crucial truth about human response to the unknown. Villagers, initially isolated in their experiences, became connected through shared observations. Regional communication, informal warning networks, and collective vigilance emerged as natural adaptations to the presence of the lights. Communities adjusted daily routines, monitored animal behavior, and recorded every encounter. In this way, the operation captured not just the phenomenon itself, but the evolving relationship between humans and something undeniably intelligent in the skies. Through these meticulous records, Operation Saucer created a foundation that would influence both scientific and public understanding for decades. Modern ufologists and government analysts have revisited these files to trace patterns consistent with contemporary UP reports, noting similarities in movement, intelligence, and selective interaction. The operation demonstrated that systematic observation, even under the constraints of secrecy, could reveal extraordinary insights, provided that curiosity, patience, and care guided the process. Yet, the operation also underscored limits both human and institutional. Questions remained unanswered. The phenomenon's origin, its purpose, and the full scope of its interactions were never clarified. Key evidence remained withheld, and the lives of those affected, while documented medically, were only partially acknowledged publicly. In this tension between discovery and secrecy, the story of Colares deepened, leaving a legacy of both insight and mystery. Operation Saucer taught a quiet lesson. Observing the unknown demands rigor, respect, and humility. It requires careful attention to patterns, empathy for those affected, and the willingness to accept that not all questions have immediate answers. The lights over the Amazon were not fleeting. They were persistent, intelligent, and deeply intertwined with the lives of those who experienced them. The Air Force's meticulous documentation, even if incomplete, preserved these experiences for future generations, forming a bridge between human observation and the enduring mystery that still inhabits the skies above Para. And so, the records stand meticulously observed, partially revealed, and quietly waiting for the world to catch up to the truths they contain. Chapter 13. Legacy, Theories, and Reflections. Even after the last cameras were packed away, the last reports filed, and the Air Force quietly withdrew from Colares. The island and its surrounding communities remained changed. The nights never quite returned to their former rhythm. Even in the softest hours, when the rivers mirrored the moon and the mangroves swayed with gentle wind, there lingered a sense that the world had grown just a little wider and more mysterious. The villagers knew what they had seen. They remembered the lights that danced over rooftops, that hovered silently above the river, that sometimes descended like a presence brushing against their skin. They remembered the beams that burned, the sudden weakness, the animals that could not escape. They remembered fear, yes, but also awe, and a deep, unshakable sense that something beyond ordinary life had reached into their world and touched them. For decades, the phenomenon remained largely absent from public discourse. Reports were scattered, testimonies buried in local memories or filed away in classified government archives. Yet the story of Colares quietly seeped into ufology circles, into scholarly debates, and into the whispered conversations of those who believed that some part of the universe refuses to remain hidden. And with each passing year, the questions only grew. What had the lights been? Were they extraterrestrial probes, examining life on Earth, or advanced experimental craft from human technology, operating beyond the knowledge of even the most senior officers in the Brazilian Air Force? Could they have been natural plasma phenomena, rare and intelligent seeming, shaped by the unique atmosphere of the Amazon Delta? Or were they something altogether different entities that exist beyond the limits of our understanding, interacting with our world in ways we cannot yet explain? Every theory carried its own weight, yet none could fully capture the strange precision, the careful targeting, the selective interaction. The evidence was stubbornly tangible. Burns, punctures, anemia, miscarriages, and even deaths. Animals reacted. Electronics faltered. The patterns repeated across time, space, and independent witnesses. This was not folklore. This was experience. This was history. Captain Yurong Ojanda's own experiences added another layer of complexity. His reports of humanoid figures, the implant in his arm, and the personal sense of communication with the lights suggested an intelligence that operated with intent and awareness. It was not merely observation, it was interaction. The beings, if beings, they seemed to understand their effects, to test limits, to engage with the human world without malice, but with unmistakable agency. Medical evidence provided its own testimony. Dr. Waleed Sisam Carvalho's careful documentation of burns, blood anomalies, and unexplained symptoms offered tangible proof that the phenomenon had a real, measurable impact. Even decades later, these records continue to challenge conventional explanations. Any theory that relies solely on imagination, fear, or natural anomaly must wrestle with these facts. Colares became a touchstone for the study of UFO, cited alongside other infamous cases worldwide: Rendlesham Forest in England, Varginha in Brazil, and, more recently, Pentagon documented UAPs over UHS airspace. Each case shares a common thread: the presence of something unknown, the experience of human witnesses, and the undeniable tension between official secrecy and public curiosity. Colares, however, stands out because of the physical consequences endured by civilians and documented meticulously by medical professionals. The island itself has embraced its story. Visitors arrive, not just as tourists, but as seekers of the quiet mysteries that inhabit its skies. Local businesses display the imagery of glowing discs and orbs. Stories once told in hushed tones now appear in print, online, and in conversation across continents. Colares has become both a memory and a living Lasana place, where history and legend intertwine, where unanswered questions linger under the night sky like distant stars. Yet, for all the fascination it inspires, the story of Colares also serves as a subtle warning. It reminds us that the unknown is not always passive. It can interact, it can leave traces, and it can change lives. It cautions us about the limits of human understanding and the consequences of secrecy. When governments investigate and withhold, when phenomena are observed and yet remain unexplained, the world is left to wonder not only about the unknown itself, but about our own readiness to face it. The legacy of Colares extends beyond the lights, beyond the beams, beyond the injuries. It lives in the people who endured those nights, in the courage of communities who faced the inexplicable without fleeing into despair, and in the scientists and investigators who continue to study, question, and listen. It reminds us that curiosity and vigilance are necessary companions in a world where not everything is visible, and not everything can be understood at once. Modern studies of UFO acknowledge that phenomena like those seen in Colares cannot be dismissed lightly. Patterns, repeatability, physical evidence, and witness credibility combine to create a data set that demands attention. The lessons of Colares resonate with ongoing investigations, echoing in Pentagon reports, international discussions, and scientific inquiries. The island, once a quiet fishing community, became a vanguard of discovery, a laboratory of mystery, and a symbol of humanity's encounter with the unknown. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Colares is the humility it imparts. No single theory fully explains the events. No authority can claim complete understanding. The lights, in their silent, deliberate way, continue to teach patience, observation, and respect for the vast, unexplored possibilities of the universe. They invite us to remain open-minded without surrendering reason, to balance wonder with critical thinking, and to recognize that the unknown can be both mesmerizing and instructive. As we reflect on the events of 1977, we find that Colares is more than a historical incident. It is a narrative of human experience in the presence of something greater than our current comprehension. It is a reminder that our planet is not entirely ours to understand, that life exists beyond the immediate and familiar, and that, sometimes, the most profound encounters arrive softly through light, through presence, through subtle, unexplainable interaction. The final thought of Colares is quiet but resonant. In the vast darkness above, amid the mirrored rivers and swaying mangroves, the unknown watches, learns, and perhaps communicates. It does not demand belief, but it invites attention. It does not impose fear, but it demands respect. And in the lingering glow of a night spent beneath these lights, we are reminded that the universe is more complex, more alive, and more beautiful than we can fully know. Some questions may never be answered. Some truths may remain elusive. Yet the story of Colares endures, not in files or reports alone, but in the hearts of those who lived it, in the whispers of the wind across the delta, and in the reflective gaze of every person who, somewhere, looks up at the night sky and wonders what lies beyond. The legacy of Colares is not simply mystery. It is remembrance, reflection, and an invitation to observe carefully, to think deeply, and to embrace the gentle hum of curiosity as we navigate our small, luminous place in a universe that often refuses to explain itself. And so, as the night stretches on, the story of Colares drifts with us, like a quiet light that never fully fades, reminding us that even in darkness, the unknown can arrive softly, deliberately, and profoundly. And now, as we close this chapter, the lights of Colares remain, lingering in memory and in wonder, waiting for those who seek to understand. And so, our journey through Colares comes to a gentle pause. The lights have faded into memory, but the questions linger, soft as a sigh across the river. We've walked through nights that watched us back, through whispers of the unknown, and through the quiet courage of those who faced what we cannot fully explain. Perhaps the answers will never arrive in full. Perhaps that is the point. Some mysteries exist to remind us of wonder, to stretch our minds beyond the familiar, and to honor the resilience of those who live beneath the stars. Here, beneath the endless sky, we leave our curiosity open, our thoughts unhurried, and our hearts calm. And if you carry a trace of these stories with you, know that you are not alone beneath the night's hush. Until the next whisper calls, rest easy, breathe slowly, and let the unknown drift alongside you, softly, without fear.